So, if you think about the underlying mechanics of a modern democracy, it operates a lot like a massive, incredibly high-stakes group project.
Oh, absolutely. The kind where the grade depends entirely on consensus.
Right. You have millions of people, wildly divergent agendas, competing geographical interests, and the entire operating system is designed specifically to create friction.
Yeah, nobody can agree on the core objective.
Exactly. Half the participants are actively trying to sabotage the other half. The rules of procedure are agonizingly slow, and the whole time there's this ticking clock. It is built to be inefficient. It is built to be slow because, speed in politics usually means someone is getting run over.
Which is incredibly frustrating for the people living in it.
It is. And then you look at authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is like that one kid in the group project who simply locks everyone else out of the shared document, changes all the passwords, and just writes the entire paper overnight.
Right. It is undeniably ruthlessly efficient.
The project gets finished. But if you dare point out a typo, that kid might just throw your laptop out a window and expel you from the class.
I mean, that analogy is painfully accurate.
Yeah.
And it forces us to confront a very uncomfortable reality about human organization. We are conditioned, particularly in Western societies, to view that kid who takes over with immediate moral revulsion.
Yeah, we equate autocracy with pure evil or backwardness or just a temporary glitch in this march toward universal freedom.
But if you want to understand global geopolitics, or even just human history, you have to temporarily suspend that moral revulsion. You really have to look at the mechanics of absolute power objectively.
Because when you strip away the propaganda, it has advantages.
It does. Authoritarianism possesses structural advantages that explain why, for the vast majority of human existence, people haven't just endured dictatorships, they've actively welcomed them. They've surrendered their liberties to them and viewed them as the only rational way to survive.
And that is the core mission for this deep dive today. We are unpacking an incredibly dense stack of historical and geopolitical source material focused entirely on the authoritarian model. We are going to look under the hood of absolute power.
Which is a dark place to look.
It really is.
Yeah.
We want to understand the actual mechanics of why tyrannies survive, how they engineer control, and what happens to a society when the brakes are completely removed from the state apparatus.
We will be looking at real-world case studies where nations were quite literally drained dry.
Yeah, we're examining the ancient psychological playbooks used to crush dissent. And we are going to wade into the incredibly messy paradox where democratic superpowers often end up funding and arming the exact same tyrants they publicly condemn.
It is a lot of ground to cover.
It is. So if you're listening to this, prepare to have some of your fundamental assumptions challenged. Because we are starting from a premise that feels almost heretical. And that premise is democracy is not the default state of humanity.
Far from it. If you look at the timeline of human civilization, the Republic is an anomaly. It's a highly experimental, fragile blip on the radar.
Really? A blip?
Yeah, I mean, until the 1980s, the idea of a democratic nation-state was confined almost exclusively to Western Europe and North America, with just a few exceptions scattered globally.
Right.
Outside of very brief, geographically isolated windows like classical Athens or the Roman Republic before the Caesars, maybe a few mercantile city-states in Renaissance Italy, the unquestioned norm of human governance has always been monarchy, oligarchy, or military dictatorship.
Wow.
For thousands of years, the authoritarian model had no serious ideological competitors. It was simply the physics of how power worked.
Okay, so I want to challenge that right out of the gate because, the narrative we are taught is that human beings have an innate burning desire for freedom.
Sure, the whole Braveheart narrative.
Exactly. If these authoritarian systems are so inherently oppressive, and if humans naturally crave liberty, how does a system that crushes liberty manage to stick around for thousands of years? I mean, how does it survive centuries of potential rebellions if it's so contrary to human nature?
Because we often misunderstand what human nature actually prioritizes. Before humans crave liberty, they crave security. They crave predictability.
Order.
Yes, order. And authoritarianism, for all its moral failings, is incredibly efficient at delivering a crude form of order. Think about the architecture of a democracy. You have independent judiciaries, legislative houses, constitutional limits, public opinion, organized labor.
All those checks and balances.
Right. Every single one of those is a bottleneck by design. They exist to slow down the state. In an authoritarian regime, those bottlenecks do not exist.
There is no bargaining.
None. There is no need to cajole a reluctant senator or compromise with a rival faction. The ruler's word translates directly into state action. If a central planner decides the nation needs a canal, a highway system, or an army mobilized, the resources are seized, the labor is conscripted, and the project is executed.
So it's the difference between navigating a massive ship using a committee vote for every turn of the wheel versus one captain just barking orders.
Precisely.
But that efficiency comes at a cost, right? Because you aren't hiring the best engineers to build that canal. You're hiring the guy who showed the most loyalty to the captain. The source material highlights this dynamic authoritarian bureaucracies aren't built on meritocracy or civil service exams. They operate entirely on patronage and nepotism.
And that is a feature, not a bug, of the system.
Right, really, a feature.
Yes.
Yeah.
In an autocracy, competence is dangerous. If you install a highly competent, independently minded general or minister, they become a threat to your power. Loyalty is the only currency that matters.
Oh, because they could overthrow you.
Exactly. So you distribute state resources, titles, and monopolies to your cronies because their survival becomes entirely dependent on your survival. That creates an incredibly durable, interlocking web of self-interest.
Which creates stability.
It does. In fact, these regimes are so structurally stable that they can endure catastrophic failures that would incinerate a democratic government overnight.
Like Fidel Castro in Cuba.
A perfect example.
I mean, this is a dictator who seized power in 1959 and held it for over half a century. And he did this while located just 90 miles off the coast of the United States.
The most powerful economic and military empire in human history.
Right. And the U.S. subjected Cuba to strenuous, decades-long economic embargoes, funded proxy invasions, attempted countless assassinations. In a democracy, if the economy shrinks by like 3%, the ruling party is swept out of office in a landslide.
Are they gone immediately?
But Castro oversaw decades of economic strangulation, rationing, and international isolation, and yet the regime never fractured.
It didn't fracture because an autocracy does not rely on the active consent of the governed. It only requires their compliance.
Which is a terrifying distinction.
It is. When a democratic leader fails to deliver economic growth, the mechanism for their removal is baked into the system, an election. When an authoritarian fails to deliver economic growth, they simply increase the level of coercion.
They just tighten the screws.
They tighten the patronage networks, expand the secret police, and suppress dissent with greater violence. But there is a deeper philosophical point here from the sources regarding economic growth.
Okay.
We tend to view democracy as a fundamental human right, a baseline necessity. But the historical record suggests something far more humbling. It suggests that democracy is a luxury.
You know, that concept really stopped me in my tracks when I was reading the materials. Calling democracy a luxury feels almost, offensive at first glance.
I know, it bristles against everything we are taught.
But when you break down the mechanics of what a functioning republic requires, it makes terrifying sense.
It requires a very specific, highly developed economic ecosystem. To sustain a democracy, you need a robust, educated middle class.
You need a population that has the surplus time and energy to engage in civic life.
Yes. You need a society wealthy enough to fund independent journalism, public universities, and a legal system that isn't easily bribed. If you are living in a deeply impoverished developing nation and your entire cognitive bandwidth is consumed by the daily struggle for physical survival,
Like finding clean water, securing enough calories for your children, avoiding localized violence.
exactly. If that is your reality, you do not have the luxury of researching a candidate's fiscal policy.
You don't care about the separation of powers when you're starving. You care about whoever is handing out grain.
It strips everything down to the absolute base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, if abstract concepts like liberty and civic duty are stacked against the immediate threat of starvation or anarchy, liberty loses every single time. Authoritarianism asks nothing of you except obedience. And in exchange for that obedience, the strongman promises that the chaos will stop.
And when people are desperate, that isn't a coerced trade. It's a deeply rational one.
Which brings us face to face with the darkest aspect of this equation. We've established that absolute power is efficient and that humans will willingly seek it out in times of crisis. But once that power is consolidated, the architecture of the state becomes entirely dependent on the psychological stability of the person wielding it.
And human psychology is remarkably ill-equipped to handle unrestrained power.
Lord Acton's famous quote always gets thrown around in these discussions. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely. It's become a total cliche, something you'd find on a bumper sticker.
Right, we hear it so often that it loses its impact.
But if we dig into the actual mechanism of that quote, based on the source material, it's not just a moral judgment. It's an observation of human neurobiology and psychology. There is a deeply intoxicating, addictive quality to unchecked authority.
Oh, without a doubt. The first taste of using state power to crush a personal rival or to seize wealth without consequence awakens appetites that are usually suppressed by societal norms.
So democracy is essentially an artificial engineered structure designed specifically to restrain our natural antisocial impulses.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it. It assumes that humans are inherently greedy, lustful, jealous, and vengeful, and it builds constitutional cages around those appetites.
And authoritarianism dismantles the cages.
Completely. It aligns the entire apparatus of the state with the unfiltered id of the ruler. When a dictator feels slighted, the state goes to war. When a dictator feels greedy, the state expropriates an industry. The personal flaws of the ruler become national policy.
Let's map out how that unrestrained power structures itself, because it's not always just like a single cartoon villain in a military uniform. There's a whole spectrum of dictatorship. On one end, you have the classic autocracy, a single absolute ruler. But on the other end, you have oligarchies, or what we often see in the modern world, the military junta.
And a junta fundamentally changes the dynamic of authoritarianism. Instead of a single charismatic leader, you have a ruling committee. You have a clique of military officers who hold absolute power as an institution. They operate essentially like a corporate board of directors.
But instead of being accountable to shareholders, their leverage is a monopoly on organized violence.
Exactly.
It's a board of directors where every member brings a loaded weapon to the conference table.
And the way they justify their rule is fascinating. They almost never claim to rule by divine right anymore. Juntas usually seize power through a coup, claiming that civilian politicians have become hopelessly corrupt or that democratic factions are tearing the country apart.
So they position themselves as the reluctant saviors.
Yes, the only institution disciplined enough to restore order.
And once that order is restored, they systematically dismantle any alternative centers of power. They outlaw opposition parties, shut down independent media, and most importantly, they weaponize the legal system.
Which is the true hallmark of an entrenched dictatorship. In a functioning society, the law is a shield that protects the citizen from the state. In a junta, the law is a sword the state uses to arbitrarily terrorize its opponents,
The rules are intentionally vague and brutally enforced.
creating an environment where everyone is technically guilty of something and therefore everyone is vulnerable.
But brute force is expensive, right?
Yeah.
And it draws terrible international PR. What fascinates me is how modern autocrats have evolved to mask this brutality. They create this incredibly sophisticated illusion of democracy.
Velvet glove over the iron fist.
Exactly. And the sources point to Hosni Mubarak's rule in Egypt as the perfect blueprint for this. He took over in 1981 after Anwar al-Sadat was assassinated. And Mubarak didn't rule as an overtly bloodthirsty warlord. He took off his military uniform, put on a tailored business suit, and played the part of a modern statesman on the global stage.
He was the archetype of the self-restrained dictator. He led a secular state within a deeply Islamic society. And he understood that to maintain power and keep Western foreign aid flowing, he needed a veneer of legitimacy.
So he staged elections, he paid lip service to a constitution.
But if you look at the mechanics of those elections, it is almost comical. In 1987, 1993, and 1999, he was re-elected while running completely unopposed.
It's like demanding a gold medal for a race where you are the only person on the track.
It really is. But then in 2005, under immense domestic pressure and pressure from the West to democratize, he finally allows a multi-party election. He allows actual opposition candidates on the ballot.
And this is where it gets crazy, because it was a masterclass in controlled opposition. He allowed the aesthetic of an election, but he retained absolute control over the entire electoral infrastructure.
Oh, the state security apparatus intimidated voters. The state-run media offered wall-to-wall coverage of Mubarak while completely blacking out his opponents.
And the ballot counting was conducted behind closed doors by loyalists. It was massively structurally rigged. And when the distant runner-up, Dr. Ayman Noor, dared to publicly contest the fraudulent results and demand a revote, the illusion of tolerance vanished instantly.
Velvet glove came off.
The iron fist came down. Dr. Noor was immediately arrested, charged with entirely fabricated counts of fraud, and thrown into a maximum security prison for 5 years.
Even when the U.S. government, Mubarak's biggest financial backer, publicly demanded his release, Mubarak simply ignored them.
It proved that the entire democratic apparatus was just set dressing. Behind the business suit, it was still a regime built purely on coercion.
And the economic results of that coercion were staggering. While a tiny sliver of military elites and connected businessmen lived in gated extravagance in Cairo, the vast majority of the Egyptian populace was trapped in crushing poverty.
The nation ranked 111th out of 177 countries on the Human Development Index.
The state offered no social mobility, no economic innovation, and no outlet for political expression.
Which totally explains why the Muslim Brotherhood became the only viable opposition. I mean, when you ban political parties, censor the press, and crush labor unions, the only gathering place left where people can speak freely and organize is the mosque.
That is a vital point. Religious networks are incredibly difficult for secular dictators to eradicate because they operate outside the traditional political sphere. So Mubarak's suppression of moderate secular opposition actually guaranteed that his only real challengers would be fundamentalists.
It backfired completely.
Exactly. Now, Mubarak represents the hard dictatorship that occasionally masquerades as a soft one. But we have to acknowledge a controversial subcategory in the typology of autocrats, the benevolent dictator.
That sounds like a total oxymoron, benevolent dictator.
It does, but historically this implies that the ends can sometimes justify the dictatorial means. You have figures who genuinely use their unchecked power not to hoard wealth in Swiss bank accounts, but to engineer massive societal leaps forward.
Like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore.
Or Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms in China. These leaders wielded absolute authority, crushed political dissent, and yet they modernized their nations. They built world-class infrastructure and pulled hundreds of millions of people out of generational poverty.
They essentially ran their countries like ruthless, hyper-efficient CEOs.
And they represent the most alluring trap of authoritarianism. They offer a seductive counter-narrative. What if the problem isn't the absolute power itself, but simply the incompetence of the person holding it?
Right, like if you have a visionary leader who genuinely prioritizes national development, they can skip the messy gridlock of democracy and force a country into the modern age.
But that brings us right back to the fatal flaw of the entire system. There is no structural guarantee.
You might roll the dice and get a Lee Kuan Yew who builds a glistening metropolis, but you are far more likely to roll the dice and get a megalomaniac who drives the country into an abyss.
Because self-restraint is not a sustainable model for governance. And when that self-restraint is entirely absent, we see nations utterly dismantled from the inside out.
This is where we must examine the case studies of profound state failure from the sources. Like, what happens when the authoritarian mechanism is entirely disconnected from reality, driven only by paranoia and greed? The modern history of Zimbabwe provides a devastating blueprint of how quickly a nation can be unraveled.
Zimbabwe is one of those tragedies that defies logic until you understand the psychology of its architect, Robert Mugabe.
And to understand the destruction, you really have to understand the hope that preceded it. Because Mugabe wasn't installed by a foreign power. He was a genuine revolutionary.
He was. In the 1960s and 70s, he was a highly educated, articulate leader of the guerrilla war against the oppressive white minority rule in what was then Rhodesia. He went to prison for over a decade for the cause.
When he emerged and won the first elections in 1980, creating an independent Zimbabwe, he was globally celebrated. He was supposed to be the model for a new, democratic, prosperous Africa.
And for a brief period, he was. But the intoxicating nature of power took hold. Slowly, methodically, Mugabe began centralizing authority. He purged political rivals, sometimes violently. He absorbed opposition parties into his own, creating a de facto one-party state.
And as his grip tightened, the economy began to stagnate.
And when an autocrat faces economic stagnation, they rarely implement necessary structural reforms because those reforms often require relinquishing control over the economy. Instead, they look for scapegoats and populist distractions.
Which leads us to the land reform program. And this is arguably one of the most catastrophic economic policies enacted in the 21st century. Zimbabwe was known as the breadbasket of southern Africa. They had a highly advanced, massively productive agricultural sector.
But the land was predominantly owned by a small minority of white farmers, a glaring legacy of colonialism.
So Mugabe institutes a policy to violently seize these commercial farms, ostensibly to redistribute the land to impoverished black Zimbabweans.
Now, if executed as a phased, compensated, and structurally supported transition, land reform is a legitimate post-colonial policy. But under Mugabe, it was chaotic, violent, and purely political.
The farms were not given to skilled agricultural workers.
No, they were handed out as patronage to Mugabe's political cronies, military officers and party loyalists who had absolutely no knowledge of large-scale commercial farming.
The mechanism of the agricultural supply chain was completely severed. I mean, you can't just hand someone a 5,000-acre farm and expect them to know how to maintain complex irrigation systems, negotiate international seed contracts, or manage crop rotation.
It requires immense technical expertise.
Right. So within a few years, agricultural output completely collapsed.
Yeah.
The breadbasket of Africa was suddenly a net importer of food. People were starving in a country with some of the most fertile soil on the continent.
And how did Mugabe respond to the sudden evaporation of the country's main economic engine? He resorted to the most desperate tool available to an unchecked state. He turned on the printing presses.
Because the International Monetary Fund and World Bank cut off lines of credit due to the chaos and human rights abuses, right?
Exactly. The government had massive deficits and no revenue. So the central bank simply began printing money to pay the military, the police, and civil servants.
The exact pillars of support he needed to stay in power.
Yes.
We use the term hyperinflation, but that word feels far too clinical to describe what actually happened on the ground. When we think of inflation, we think of milk going up 50 cents. Under Mugabe, inflation hit 11.2 million% by 2008.
11.2 million%. The mechanism of money, the shared fiction that a piece of paper holds value, completely disintegrated.
Just imagine the psychological terror of that reality.
You get paid in the morning, and if you don't sprint to the market to buy groceries within an hour, your entire paycheck might only be worth a handful of vegetables by sunset.
Prices weren't doubling every month, they were doubling every few hours. The economy reverted to primitive bartering.
There is a physical artifact from this era that perfectly encapsulates the madness. In January 2009, the central bank actually printed and released a $50 billion note.
Wait, a single bill?
Yes. Just visualize that. A single piece of paper authorized by the government that says $50 billion. And the purchasing power of that note on the day it was issued was exactly enough to buy 2 loaves of bread.
That is insane. You had citizens carrying wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy basic necessities.
Only to have thieves steal the wheelbarrow and leave the cash in the street because the paper was worthless.
The societal collapse was absolute. Public services evaporated. Hospitals had no medicine, no electricity, and no doctors because the doctors' salaries were completely worthless.
The World Health Organization reported that under Mugabe's rule, the life expectancy in Zimbabwe plummeted to the lowest on earth, 37 years for men and 34 years for women.
34 years.
Population dying of preventable diseases, starvation, and a rampant AIDS epidemic. UNICEF estimated that 25% of all children in the country were orphaned.
And in 2008, nearly 4,000 people died from a medieval disease, cholera, simply because the water treatment facilities had completely broken down.
And yet, despite turning his nation into an absolute graveyard, the political mechanism of authoritarianism kept him insulated.
Because in 2008, he actually lost the initial round of the presidential election to Morgan Tsvangirai. A dictator suffered a humiliating defeat at the ballot box, but in an autocracy, the vote doesn't matter. Whoever controls the security forces matters.
Mugabe simply refused to accept the results. He unleashed a wave of state-sponsored terror. Paramilitary groups systematically hunted down opposition organizers.
Over 160 people were murdered, and an estimated 5,000 were abducted, tortured, and brutally beaten.
The violence was so severe that Tsvangirai had to withdraw from the runoff election just to stop the slaughter of his supporters.
Even when international pressure forced a power-sharing agreement, Mugabe simply ignored the terms, kept control of the military and the police, and maintained his grip until he was well into his 90s.
It is a testament to the terrifying durability of an entrenched autocrat.
Zimbabwe is the story of ideological paranoia destroying a nation. But the second case study from the sources Nigeria is a very different flavor of authoritarian ruin. If Zimbabwe was driven off a cliff by one man's obsession with control, Nigeria is the story of a giant slowly bled dry by systemic parasitic corruption.
Nigeria is perhaps the most frustrating geopolitical paradox of the 20th and early 21st centuries. The potential of the nation is almost boundless.
It is an absolute demographic titan, housing roughly 20% of sub-Saharan Africa's population.
It possesses massive agricultural potential, deep water ports, and most importantly, it sits on an ocean of high-grade crude oil. It is the 6th largest oil exporter in the world. By every metric of geography and resources, Nigeria should be the industrial economic powerhouse of the African continent. It should be wealthy beyond measure.
But they suffer from a phenomenon economists call the resource curse. When a nation discovers massive, easily extractable wealth like oil, and it lacks strong democratic institutions to manage that wealth, the oil doesn't enrich the people.
It just creates an unimaginably massive prize for whatever military faction is ruthless enough to seize the government.
Exactly. You don't need to develop a complex, innovative economy. You don't need a highly educated workforce to build technology or manufacture goods. You just need to control the pipelines and the state oil company, the NNPC.
A succession of military dictatorships and ruling cliques in Nigeria realized this. They treated the national treasury not as an engine for public development, but as a personal offshore bank account.
The billions of dollars generated by oil exports bypassed the Nigerian economy entirely, funneled directly into the pockets of generals, corrupt politicians, and their patronage networks.
The disparity it created is sickening. You have this nation generating billions in petroleum revenue every month, and yet by 2007, an estimated 70% of the Nigerian population was surviving on the equivalent of $1 a day.
$1 a day. But it's not just the grand theft at the top that destroys the country. It's how that corruption cascades down through every level of society. The culture of patronage creates a system where nothing functions without a bribe.
When the leadership operates purely on extraction and graft, it signals to the entire bureaucracy that public service is simply an opportunity for extortion. The state bureaucracy in Nigeria swelled massively, absorbing over 80% of the annual government budget just to pay salaries.
Yet productivity was non-existent. Civil servants would routinely sleep at their desks, ignore their duties, or brazenly demand cash bribes from citizens just to process a basic piece of paperwork.
The social contract was completely broken.
The detail that perfectly illustrates this granular level of extortion is the police roadblocks. The New York Times documented how local police forces, completely unpaid or severely underpaid by the central government, would simply set up roadblocks on major highways, sometimes every few hundred yards.
They weren't checking for safety, they were running a shakedown operation.
They would extort a bribe of 20 naira, which was about 15 cents, from every single driver.
And we must think about the macroeconomic mechanism of that 15-cent bribe. If a truck driver carrying agricultural goods to market has to pay a 15-cent bribe at 40 different roadblocks, the cost of transport skyrockets.
To absorb that cost, the price of the food goes up.
The consumer, who is already living on $1 a day, starves. The farmer's goods become uncompetitive. Legitimate commerce is slowly strangled to death by a million tiny cuts of extortion, all while the state fails to provide the basic security those police officers are ostensibly hired to maintain.
And wrapping this entire economic nightmare is a profound layer of social and ethnic friction. Nigeria is described in the text as not being a natural nation-state.
This is a critical factor in understanding the fragility of many post-colonial authoritarian regimes. Nigeria's borders were not drawn organically by the people living there.
No, they were drawn with a ruler on a map in Europe by British colonial administrators solely for their own logistical convenience.
They grouped together a massive territory containing over 300 distinct languages, dialects, and ethnic groups. Crucially, it forced together a predominantly Muslim north and a predominantly Christian and animist south.
It's a geopolitical powder keg. You have intense religious, ethnic, and regional divides. And when you drop a deeply corrupt authoritarian government into that mix, a government that rules by patronage, meaning it funnels the oil wealth exclusively to its own ethnic group while ignoring the rest, you are actively throwing gasoline on those historical grievances.
So we arrive at the ultimate question, and I know everyone listening is wondering this. If the system is this broken, if the corruption is this blatant, and the poverty is this deep, why do millions of people endure it? Why doesn't the society just rise up and burn the system down every single time?
To understand that endurance, we have to dismantle the myths that surround authoritarianism. We tend to view dictatorships through the lens of a Hollywood movie. We picture a brutal villain imposing his will on a completely united, rebellious populace using 247 military force.
But brute force is actually the least efficient tool in an autocrat's playbook. The reality is far more psychological. Autocrats survive by utilizing ancient, highly refined mechanisms of social control.
Let's break down the Machiavellian playbook. We assume that the surveillance state and the suppression of dissent are modern inventions, born in the 20th century with the KGB or the Stasi. But the tactical blueprint for crushing human resistance is thousands of years old. Aristotle, writing in classical Greece, essentially authored the definitive field manual on how to be a successful tyrant.
Aristotle was a brilliant sociologist, and he understood that a tyrant's greatest threat isn't a foreign army, It is trust among his own subjects. So the primary goal of the autocrat is isolation.
He noted that successful despots don't just eliminate vocal critics, they actively dismantle civil society. They ban communal meals, they outlaw social clubs, they restrict cultural gatherings.
Think about the mechanism behind banning a communal meal. It sounds absurd to us.
It does, but a shared meal is where people relax. It's where they complain about the price of grain or the arrogance of the local magistrate. It's where shared grievances are identified and where bonds of trust are forged.
Exactly. If you cannot trust your neighbor, you cannot organize a strike. If you cannot organize a strike, you cannot organize a revolution. By fracturing society down to the isolated individual, the tyrant ensures that the masses remain an uncoordinated, atomized crowd rather than a unified political force.
Furthermore, Aristotle identified the tactic of deliberate exhaustion. Autocrats intentionally burden their subjects with crushing poverty, exorbitant taxes, and relentless hard labor.
Aristotle literally pointed to the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. The architectural majesty of the pyramids is secondary. Their primary political function was to consume the physical energy of the populace.
If a man spends 14 hours a day dragging stones under a brutal sun just to secure a handful of rations for his family, he does not have the physical or mental surplus required to plot a rebellion. Poverty is a tool of pacification.
And if you fast forward to Renaissance Italy, you get Niccolo Machiavelli, who took these ancient observations and distilled them into a brutally pragmatic instruction manual for rulers, the Prince.
Machiavelli was the ultimate realist. He stripped all morality out of politics. He argued that if a ruler wants to survive, they must learn, quote, how not to be good.
Because conventional morality is a vulnerability in a ruthless world. Machiavelli instructed rulers to be masters of optics and deception. A prince must appear pious, compassionate, and honest to the masses, but behind the palace doors, he must be willing to lie, cheat, and murder without a second thought.
He famously debated whether it is better for a ruler to be loved or feared.
And his conclusion is chillingly logical. He says, ideally, you want both. But if you have to choose, always choose fear.
Why? Because love is transactional and fickle. People will love you as long as you are giving them something, but the moment danger approaches, they will abandon you to save themselves. Fear, however, is maintained by the dread of punishment, and that never fades.
And regarding that punishment, Machiavelli offers perhaps his darkest yet most effective piece of advice. If a ruler must injure someone or eliminate a threat, the strike must be absolute, severe, and devastating.
Mild retribution is the greatest mistake a dictator can make.
The mechanism of that makes twisted sense. If you confiscate half of a rival's wealth or throw him in prison for a year, you haven't neutralized him. You have just created a highly motivated enemy who still possesses enough resources and connections to exact revenge.
If you are going to strike, you destroy their entire family, seize all their assets, and erase their allies. You must injure them so profoundly that they are physically incapable of striking back.
Do all the cruelties at once, swiftly, so the public shock wears off. But when you hand out benefits, a tax cut, a public holiday, you dole them out slowly, drop by drop, so that people are constantly reminded of your generosity.
It is the systemic, national-scale application of psychological abuse. And it leads us to another major myth. We assume that authoritarian rulers are entirely unpopular and that their power rests solely on this abuse. We assume that because they aren't elected, they lack legitimacy and are universally despised.
As Americans, our entire political identity is built on the philosophy of John Locke. We believe that legitimacy only derives from the consent of the governed. If there wasn't a free and fair election, the ruler is illegitimate. End of story.
But historically, humanity has accepted a much broader, much stranger definition of legitimacy.
For millennia, legitimacy was entirely decoupled from the will of the populace. In medieval Europe, it was the divine right of kings. The monarch was appointed by God, meaning any rebellion against the crown was not just treason, it was a mortal sin against the creator of the universe.
In imperial China, it was the mandate of heaven. The emperor's legitimacy was proven not by ballots, but by cosmic harmony. If the rivers didn't flood, the harvests were bountiful, and the borders were secure, it was proof the emperor held the mandate. If famine struck, the mandate was lost, and rebellion was justified.
And in the modern era, that divine right has been replaced by the cult of personality, charismatic legitimacy. A leader derives their right to rule from legendary feats.
Like Napoleon Bonaparte, he didn't need an election to legitimize his rule in the eyes of the French peasantry. His staggering string of military victories across Europe was his legitimacy.
Or Fidel Castro, who derived his legitimacy from successfully leading a guerrilla revolution against a corrupt U.S.-backed dictator.
Yeah.
They become living myths, and the population enthusiastically submits to the myth.
Which taps into a profound psychological truth observed by the 19th century Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky argued that we fundamentally misunderstand human desire. We assume humans want total freedom, but freedom is agonizing.
Freedom requires constant decision-making. It carries the heavy burden of personal responsibility, and it forces you to live with the terrifying consequences of your own choices.
Dostoevsky argued that the masses often desire security and certainty far more than they desire liberty. They will gladly surrender their freedom to an absolute authority if that authority promises to lift the burden of choice from their shoulders.
Think of it like being a passenger in a car, speeding down a treacherous, icy mountain road at midnight. Navigating that road, making the split-second decisions to avoid a crash, is incredibly stressful.
Most people don't want to drive. They want to hand the keys to someone who acts like they know exactly what they're doing. They want to sit in the passenger seat, close their eyes, and be told they are going to arrive safely.
They will gladly surrender their agency to a dictator, even if they suspect the dictator might be a maniac, because the alternative, taking the wheel in the middle of a blizzard, is too terrifying to contemplate.
It is a dark trade-off, but it's one that has been made countless times in history. Even the most notorious tyrants, Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, enjoyed massive waves of genuine, enthusiastic popular support during significant portions of their rule.
They restored shattered national pride, they brought chaotic post-war economies to heal, and they provided a unified, albeit terrifying, vision for the future. A dictator does not strictly need majority support to maintain a police state, but having it makes their governance infinitely smoother.
Okay, so if people are genuinely willing to trade their liberty for a sense of order and security, we have to ask the most controversial question of this entire deep dive. Does the authoritarian model ever actually deliver on that trade? Is there ever a scenario where the surrender of freedom is necessary for a society's physical survival?
This forces us to confront an incredibly uncomfortable historical reality. We want to believe that dictatorships are purely destructive, that they have absolutely no redeeming qualities. But history shows us that autocracies can and have brought profound order out of absolute chaos.
Stalin's forced industrialization of Soviet Russia resulted in the deaths of millions through famine, purges, and the Gulag system. But that brutal centralized command economy also transformed an agrarian peasant society into an industrial superpower in less than 2 decades.
A transformation that allowed them to absorb the brunt of the Nazi war machine and ultimately break it. The human cost was apocalyptic, but the state survived.
But the most fascinating example of this isn't from the brutal geopolitics of the 20th century. It's an ancient sociological concept from the source material regarding Carl Wittfogel's theory of Oriental despotism and the creation of the hydraulic civilization.
This blew my mind, because it is where environmental geography directly dictates the nature of human government.
Wittfogel theorized that the intense, centralized dictatorship of Imperial China was not a random cultural development. It was an evolutionary, organic response to a massive environmental challenge. The staple crop of ancient China was rice.
And rice cultivation is not like wheat farming in Europe. You cannot simply scatter seeds in a field, rely on seasonal rainfall, and harvest the crop as an independent family unit. Rice requires highly specific, massive, and precisely controlled amounts of water.
To survive in that geography, you have to tame mighty, violently unpredictable river systems. You have to build sprawling networks of dikes, dams, drainage canals, and irrigation ditches that stretch across hundreds of miles.
And here is the mechanical reality. A loose confederation of independent democratic farmers cannot build a regional dam. They cannot coordinate the logistics.
Exactly. The environment literally demanded a dictator. To build and maintain these massive hydraulic systems, society required scientific planning, centralized control, and most importantly, the ability to mobilize and conscript human labor on an unprecedented scale.
It required a vast, highly organized bureaucracy to manage the water, because if the water management failed, millions of people would starve to death in a matter of months.
So the Chinese populace entered into a fundamental, unspoken contract with the state. They traded their labor, their autonomy, and their freedom for the guarantee of food. They accepted their status as subjects, not citizens. They have profound duties to the state, but virtually no individual rights.
And yet we must acknowledge the success of this hydraulic despotism. It produced staggering technological and agricultural achievements. It allowed the land to support a massive population for centuries without exhausting the soil.
And incredibly, the imperial Chinese system lasted longer than any other continuous form of government in human history. From roughly 900 AD to 1800 AD, it was intensely despotic, it was brutal to the individual, but it was phenomenally successful at its core biological mandate, keeping the collective population alive in a hostile environment.
It is the ultimate proof that our modern liberal democratic model is not the only way a complex society can function. But it's vital to make one crucial distinction here before we move into the modern era. As bad as authoritarianism is, where the state demands your obedience and crushes political opposition, there is a basement beneath it: totalitarianism.
Yes, an authoritarian ruler wants you to obey the laws, pay your taxes, and stay out of politics. If you do that, they generally leave your private life alone.
A totalitarian regime like Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, or modern North Korea seeks to control not just your political actions, but your every thought. They seek to obliterate the private sphere entirely, utilizing mass surveillance, slave labor, and ideological brainwashing. An autocrat wants your obedience. A totalitarian wants your soul.
All right, so we've looked at ancient water management, Renaissance princes, and African kleptocracies. But how does this authoritarian model interact with the modern, supposedly enlightened world? Specifically, how does it interact with the United States? Because this is where the moral high ground gets completely obliterated by geopolitical reality.
Following World War II, the global landscape fractured into a binary struggle: the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in an existential, decades-long conflict between capitalism and communism.
The U.S. adopted a strategy of global containment to stop the spread of Soviet influence. And in that high-stakes environment, morality became a liability.
The U.S. engaged in what was essentially global bribery, dollar diplomacy. We went to developing nations and forced them to pick a side. We offered massive foreign aid packages, sophisticated military weaponry, and economic access, provided they aligned with Washington instead of Moscow.
And in the frantic rush to secure the global chessboard, the United States repeatedly and knowingly backed right-wing military dictatorships. The supposed champion of the free world routinely turned a blind eye to horrific human rights abuses, death squads, and the suppression of democracy in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, so long as the dictator in charge was reliably anti-communist.
But let me play devil's advocate here for a moment, adopting the pure Machiavellian realist perspective. If you are sitting in the Pentagon or the CIA during the height of the Cold War, and you genuinely believe that Soviet communism is an existential threat that could lead to global nuclear annihilation, don't you have to make those ugly alliances?
Don't you have to ally with a right-wing strongman to prevent a nation from falling to a Soviet-backed insurgency? It's ugly, it's hypocritical, but isn't it necessary for geopolitical survival?
The realist argument certainly attempts to justify it as a necessary evil. But the paradox and the ultimate failure of that strategy is the long-term blowback. When a democratic superpower funds a tyrant to maintain short-term stability, they almost always sow the seeds for a massive, catastrophic crisis a decade or two later.
And there is no better example of this catastrophic blowback than Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The source material refers to him as the perfect tyrant.
Saddam was an absolute monster. He consciously modeled his rule on Joseph Stalin. He controlled Iraq through a monolithic apparatus, the Ba'ath Party, which penetrated every level of society.
He utilized police-state terror, highly publicized show trials, and frequent purges of his own military officers to ensure absolute loyalty. He even utilized chemical weapons poison gas against Kurdish civilians within his own borders.
And yet, during the 1980s, the United States quietly supported Saddam Hussein's regime. They provided intelligence, economic aid, and dual-use technology. Why? Because Saddam was fighting a brutal, grinding war against the newly established Islamic Republic of Iran.
Iran was viewed by Washington as the greater, more immediate threat to regional stability. The U.S. operated on the ancient, deeply flawed logic: the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
They calculated that a secular, bloodthirsty dictator in Baghdad would balance out the religious theocracy in Tehran. But the moment the Iran-Iraq War ended, Saddam turned that U.S.-backed military machine toward Kuwait, triggering the Gulf War.
And even after he was contained, he spent the 1990s brutalizing his own people. While Iraqis starved under international sanctions, Saddam built an estimated 50 new, lavish presidential palaces costing $1.5 billion. He was the definition of an unrepentant, destabilizing tyrant right up until the U.S. invaded and ousted him in 2003.
Which brings us to the final, perhaps most tragic delusion of Western foreign policy, the democracy delusion. The U.S. operates under the deeply naive assumption that democracy is the natural resting state of humanity. We assume that if you simply remove the dictator, if you depose Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi or the military junta in Haiti, a beautiful, fully functioning liberal democracy will spontaneously spring up from the ashes.
But as we discussed earlier, democracy is a luxury. It requires an ecosystem. You can't just drop a ballot box into a country devastated by decades of trauma, poverty, and ethnic division and expect a republic to bloom.
There's a UN survey referenced in the sources that drives this home perfectly. They surveyed 18 Latin American countries, many of which had recently transitioned to democracy. The survey found that a majority of citizens would actually prefer to return to a dictatorship if that dictator could guarantee economic benefits.
Because the reality of their democracy was a weak, corrupt, gridlocked government incapable of providing basic services. When 43% of your population is living in deep poverty, the right to vote feels like a cruel joke if it doesn't put food on the table.
This leads us to the arguments of foreign policy analysts like Robert Kaplan and the philosopher Reinhold Niebuhr. They argue that the United States fundamentally misunderstands the sequence of human development.
This is the anarchy argument. Kaplan points to the U.S. intervention in Haiti in 1994. The U.S. deployed 22,000 troops to remove a military junta and restore a democratically elected president. We declared it a massive victory for freedom.
But what actually happened? The institutions in Haiti were completely hollowed out. There was no middle class, no functioning civil service, no tradition of loyal opposition. The subsequent elections saw a dismal 5% voter turnout.
The country spiraled into chronic instability, gang violence, and economic collapse, to the point where U.S. Marines had to be deployed again a decade later just to prevent the state from completely dissolving.
And we saw the exact same tragic sequence unfold on a much larger, bloodier scale in Iraq following the 2003 invasion. We removed the perfect tyrant, Saddam Hussein, dismantled his Ba'athist state, and attempted to install a democracy by fiat.
The result was not a flourishing republic. It was years of horrific sectarian civil war, an explosion of insurgency, and a power vacuum that birthed even more extreme terrorist organizations.
Because removing the dictator doesn't give you democracy if the prerequisites for democracy don't exist. It just gives you a power vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum.
It is a bleak, terrifying conclusion, but it's one we have to face. For many deeply impoverished, institutionally fractured nations, the geopolitical menu does not offer a choice between a cruel dictator and a benevolent democracy. Those are not the options on the table.
The only actual choice is between the brutal, suffocating order of a tyrant and the horrific, bloody chaos of total anarchy.
And when a society is staring into the abyss of anarchy where there is no law, no police, where warlords roam the streets and life is truly, as Thomas Hobbes described, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, the populace will always, inevitably, run back into the arms of a strong man who promises to restore order. They will surrender their freedom to stop the bleeding.
Which brings us full circle on this deep dive. If you've been listening, you have just taken a very dark, very necessary tour through the mechanics of absolute power. We've examined how authoritarianism leverages our psychological need for security, how tyrannies drain the wealth of nations like in Zimbabwe and Nigeria, and we've confronted the uncomfortable reality that removing a dictator often unleashes horrors far worse than the dictatorship itself.
It is a sobering realization that challenges our deepest political orthodoxies. But I want to leave you with a final thought, a question to extrapolate from everything we've discussed today. The core thesis of the source material is that democracy is not a baseline right. It is an economic luxury. It requires a prosperous, robust middle class to absorb the friction and inefficiency of the system.
So if that is the mechanical prerequisite, what happens to a supposedly stable modern Western democracy if its middle class begins to hollow out? What happens if the economy stagnates for a generation, wealth inequality mirrors the Gilded Age, and the political system becomes so gridlocked it can no longer solve basic societal problems?
If the luxury of prosperity fades, does the patience for democracy fade with it? Do we inevitably start looking for that one kid who promises to take the laptop and just force the project to get done? It is the most important political question of our time. Keep questioning the structures of power around you, keep doing the reading, and we will see you next time on the Deep Dive.